depending on convenience, sometimes we will write the inner product of a vector x with a vector y in round brackets, sometimes in rectangular brackets, or mean the same thing. So, first we are looking at the real case. So, what is an inner product on a real linear vector space? It is a way to assign a real number to any two of vectors which are given to you. So, x and y are any vectors from the vector space V, and given the two vectors, we say the inner product of x and y is written in this way and it is a real number. Okay. So, now I don't write that it is a real number because it is written here and it is clear to you. What are all the properties that this bracket, this inner product should have, so that it is a useful idea? I refer you to equation 33 on page 8 and I just verbally describe them, and at any point if you have any question you will interrupt and ask me. I think overall this method will allow me to cover material more efficiently. Of course it saves some potential energy, kinetic energy also. First property, equation 33. This is symmetric in x and y. If you interchange x and y, this number will not change. So that is symmetry property. Is this method of my giving the course, the lecture, all right? No difficult. Second property. If you keep y fixed and you imagine putting in some linear combination of vectors in the place of x, this whole thing is linear in x. So it is written here, suppose you have your lambda x plus mu x prime, where lambda and mu are of course real numbers. This scalar product or inner product will be lambda times product of x with y plus mu times x prime with y, and so on. And you can see from the symmetry property and the linearity in x that automatically it has to be linear in y also. You don't have to separately say that it is linear in y. Properties 1 and 2 imply linearity in the other argument. Next comes property number 3, the non-degeneracy. This is a very important and somewhat subtle idea. Supposing for some vector x, this inner product x with y is 0 for all y, then this can happen only if x is a 0 vector. This is called the non-degeneracy property. This is the third in the list of properties given. What it means is that, so this goes both ways. If you take a non-zero vector, it will have non-zero scalar product with something or the other, in particular with itself. So, given a vector which is not zero, there will definitely be many vectors with which it has non-zero scalar product. And carrying on from this non-degeneracy, so this is the non-degeneracy property of the inner product. And the fourth is the positive definiteness of the inner product. That is, if x is non-zero, then its inner product with itself is strictly greater than 0. Of course, inner products now are all real numbers in the present discussion. So we make the statement, the product of a vector with itself, if the vector is non-zero, this will be strictly greater than 0. Conversely, you can say, if the inner product of x with itself is 0, that can happen only if x itself was a 0 vector. Alright, so this is the concept of the inner product on a real vector space. And as I said in the beginning, there are many consequences, many derived ideas, and some of them are at the level of vectors themselves, others are at the level of operators. So I will tell you both.
Excuse me.
Yes.
Could you please go over that again?
Which part?
For some x.
This one, non-degeneracy property. This says, suppose you choose some vector x and you find that its inner product with every other vector is 0. That can happen only if x itself is 0. If x is non-zero, there is definitely some y for which this is non-zero. Understand? Now when you come to the next time, you see immediately, surely if x is non-zero, at least its inner product with itself will be non-zero.
Okay, so I don't understand how does it claim the non-degeneracy?
It's not a claim, it is a property we impose to get an inner product. So I repeat, what is an inner product in a real vector space? It is a rule to give a real number when any two vectors are given. That rule must obey properties 1, 2, 3 and 4. Property number 1, it must be symmetric in x and y. Property number 2, it must be linear in x, therefore also linear in y because of the symmetry. Property 3, non-degeneracy. This is the one which requires a little bit of imagination to understand it. And property 4 is called a positive definiteness.
Sir, is it possible that y is 0 for all other x's, then xy will be 0?
Say that again.
Suppose we say xy that is 0 for all x, all y, then only x is 0.
I'm sorry, I did not understand your statement.
That xy is 0,
What is kept fixed and what is varying?
that is y is varying,
Y is varying.
then x is 0, then xy is 0. Only that is not degeneracy. Right, sir?
I should repeat this. You take some x, keep it fixed.
Okay.
Huh? Keep it fixed. Then you calculate xy for all possible y.
Y is 0.
Y is made to vary over the entire vector space.
Yes.
X is fixed.
Yes.
Correct? But if xy is 0 for all y, then this x must have been 0.
Inverse is true or not?
What is the inverse? Now you tell me.
Suppose you fix y,
Fix y, yeah.
then for all values of x, fix below y. If xy is 0, then y must be 0.
Here, y will be 0.
Correct, but why is that is trivial because of what? Property number 1. What is property number 1?
Yes,
So you said it correctly, and you see that what you said is implied by the symmetry and this. So both statements are correct. Very glad this was nicely clarified. Okay, so now we come to some of the consequences at the level of vectors. So I refer you to the bottom of page 8. I hope all of you participants do have my notes with you. If anyone has left it in the room, then you will have difficulty. I find this is quite comfortable for me, not having to write everything. First is that you can think of, you can give the idea of the length of a vector. Length of a vector now will be square root of the inner product of x with itself. We have said here that from the positive definiteness property, if x is non-zero, its inner product with itself will be a real number strictly greater than 0. So you can take the square root, positive square root, that will also be a real positive number. That is will be called the length of x. So now I want you to appreciate, up to today's discussion, we had never introduced the idea of an inner product. So in all the discussion about linear independence, linear dependence, linear combination, eigenvector, completeness, basis, all those things never depend on the idea of length of a vector. That I want you to. Second property, this is on equations 34 and 35. If you have a pair of vectors x and y such that their inner product is 0, and of course x and y are both non-zero, then we say they are orthogonal to one another. Clear? Now, this idea of two vectors being orthogonal was also never used, never needed up to today's discussion. So the concept of eigenvectors, the concept of a set of basis vectors, I often used, I said, let us imagine a choice of a basis for the vector space. Yesterday, day before, I used this idea. Some of you I know imagined or said, are these unit vectors, are they mutually orthogonal? No such statement is needed, and one cannot make such a statement because until 20 minutes ago we did not have inner product. But now we have a meaning to the statement that a vector x is perpendicular to a vector y. That's a symmetric property. Of course, it is understood both x and y are non-zero. Next is the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. For any pair of vectors x and y, the inner product is a real number, but it may be positive or negative. Cauchy-Schwarz inequality says the inner product of x with y is less than or equal to the product of the lengths of x and y. Is this clear? This is the scalar product or inner product of x with y. Take the magnitude. Of course, it's a real number, but it might be negative. Take the magnitude. This Cauchy-Schwarz inequality is the statement that this will be less than or equal to the product of the length of x and the length of y. So I put a square root. Why? Because then this part will give you the length of x and this part will give you the length of y. Okay? So I will not give you the derivation. It is not complicated, but it is a very important problem. Now we go to page 9. Given any two vectors, now we can start drawing pictures. Suppose I take two vectors in the linear vector space x and y. I can think of the angle between them.
Sir,
Yes.
what is this equality only for x is equal to lambda y? Question number 36.
Or the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. So you can ask, if this is a less than or equal to statement, when do you get an equality? You can ask that question. You will get an equality only if x and y are multiples of each other. You can say they are parallel to each other. So the equality will appear only if y is equal to lambda x
That
for
means
some
parallel.
scale. Huh?
That means parallel.
Parallel. Or anti-parallel also. They point in the opposite direction. That's also good. So the equality holds only when they are multiples of one another. Good. So now on page 9, I have a definition of the angle between two vectors. It is determined, I don't write it now, it is determined by the inner product of x with y. The main thing is to see that this angle theta strictly lies between 0 and pi. There is no ambiguity. You can always find out the angle between any x and y, assuming both are non-zero. The x and y must be non-zero vectors, then there is a meaningful angle between them. Okay. Next, This is proper statement E on page 9. Suppose I pick up some subspace V1 in V. You know what? You remember what a subspace is? It is a set of vectors in V with the property that multiples of vectors in V1, linear combinations of vectors in V1 all belong to V1. Which means even though it is only a part of the full vector space, by itself it is a vector space. Alright. And remember, so now you can appreciate in defining the concept of a subspace of the vector space, there was no idea of inner product, no idea of length, no idea of angle, no idea of perpendicular. Want you to appreciate. So the concept of a subspace is requires much less input. Alright, so now once we have an inner product given, then in every subspace in the full vector space, you can construct another subspace, V1 perpendicular. And this is called, this is uniquely defined and this has a name. It is called the orthogonal complement of V1. So what does it consist of? It consists of all vectors in the full vector space which are perpendicular to all vectors in V1. So that's called the orthogonal complement. Now, if we go back to ordinary three-dimensional Euclidean space, and I did present some examples with that in mind in the last few days, you know that the xy plane, we always think of x, y and z as mutually perpendicular axes. If you do not use the concept of dot product among vectors, a general basis for three-dimensional Euclidean space will be a set of what we call oblique axes. Then x, y and z need not be perpendicular axes, perpendicular to each other, but they must be linearly independent. We can't say anything more. Then of course the xy plane will be a subspace of the full three-dimensional Euclidean space. But you do not have the concept of something perpendicular to xy until you introduce the scalar product idea. Once you introduce the scalar product idea, then of course there is a unique way to start with a subspace to determine another subspace. Everything perpendicular to vectors in V1. And the most important property here is that the full space is always a direct sum of any subspace V1 and its orthogonal complement. Okay? And this means that if you take any vector in the full vector space, it can be written in a unique way in this fashion: x1 plus y1, where x1 is in your subspace and y1 is in the orthogonal subspace. Now, in ordinary three dimensions, this would mean using that angle concept, using perpendicularity concept, any vector in three-dimensional space is the unique sum of a vector in the xy plane plus a vector in the perpendicular z-axis. That decomposition is unique. If you did not have inner product, decomposition would not be unique. Alright. So, is this method of going over the material acceptable? Is quite clear. Alright, now I come to item 8 on page 9. We had this general concept of a basis in a vector space. What is the basis made up of? A set of n vectors, n being the dimension of V, with the property that they are linearly independent. That does not require a scalar product idea, inner product idea. Now that we have an inner product in hand, we can talk of special kinds of bases for the vector space, so-called orthonormal basis. What is an orthonormal basis? It is a basis in which each of the e's is a vector of unit length. It's a normalized vector, and any two of them are mutually perpendicular. So, an orthonormal basis is a basis in which the inner product among the basis vectors follows this condition. So, this is equation 38. Alright. Now, for the case without scalar product, without inner product, we had an equation which told us how any two bases are related. So, this is it. So, if you can go back to the notes of yesterday or day before, there was some equation, now I don't remember which one. I had written something like this. What was it?
S inverse.
S inverse. Yeah, that was the notation I had used. So what we had said was that given one basis in a vector space, you can always change to some other basis. And this change is determined by a matrix which is n-dimensional and which has an inverse. So non-singular matrices describe all possible change of basis in a linear vector space. Now with the inner product, among all possible bases, we have special ones, namely orthonormal bases. Now here I must mention to you that once you have an inner product, it does not mean that you must always use a basis of the orthonormal type. Some calculation, some problem, you may find it useful to you to use a non-orthonormal basis. Nobody can stop you. It's a free country, as they say. So, if you find it convenient, use it. But if it is useful to you, work in an orthonormal basis. Okay? So, this is important. So, now, what happens to this general change of basis if you restrict yourself to orthonormal basis? We want to know what properties will this matrix have if this is an orthonormal basis and this also is an orthonormal basis. That is now given by equate part statement G on page 9. Maybe I just write it here. The equations, now there is no need to use superscripts and subscripts. Everything can be written as a subscript. If you want to make a change from one orthonormal basis to another orthonormal basis, then the matrices S which have to be used have a special property. They are, of course, real and n by n, but they have an orthogonality property. Remember that E's are unit vectors and mutually orthogonal. The E primes are other unit vectors, mutually orthogonal. What are these things then? These are the cosines of the angles between old basis vectors and new basis vectors. So this is a matrix made up of direction cosines, and this matrix has to obey these conditions. S transpose S equals S transpose. This should be the unit matrix in n dimensions. So this is equation 39, and I can now slip in the concept of the group here. Later I will deal with it a little more in detail. Matrices capital S which are n-dimensional and real and which obey this condition are called orthogonal matrices, orthogonal rotations. In 3 dimensions, you have 3-dimensional orthogonal rotations. Now, you probably know the difference between what are called proper rotations and improper rotations. From this equation, suppose I take the determinant of both sides, what will I get? What is the determinant of S transpose S? Yeah, that is true, because the right is a unit matrix. But before you look at that, in terms of the properties of determinants, determinant of a product is a product of the determinants. Correct? So this is equal to determinant of S transpose times determinant of S. What do you know about the determinant of a transposed matrix in terms of the origin? There is no change. You know that determinant of A transpose equals determinant of A. This is something you would know from determinant. Therefore, what is this equal to? This is determinant of S squared. So I repeat, what are the 2 rules you have to use? Determinant of a product of matrices equals product of determinants. Item 1. Item 2, determinant of the transpose is the same as the original. So use both, you will get this. So now what does it mean? What are the possible values of the determinant of a matrix which obeys this?
Plus minus.
Plus 1 or it could be minus. Both are allowed. So we would say, if you go from one orthonormal basis to another orthonormal basis, using a matrix S for which the determinant is plus 1, you will say the 2 bases are related by a proper rotation, proper orthogonal transformation. And another way of saying the same thing is thank you. So, another way, picturesque way of saying it is, and this is a statement you can take in any dimension, we say that if 2 orthonormal bases are related by a proper rotation, determinant S equal to plus 1, we say they have the same handedness. That is the phrase which is used. Proper rotations preserve the handedness of an orthonormal basis. I will give you the example in 3 dimensions in a moment. If on the other hand determinant of S is minus 1, we say that we are dealing with an improper rotation. Improper rotation changes the handedness of an orthonormal basis. So now, in 3 dimensions, of course we can only draw 2-dimensional figures. Let y and z be in the plane of the board and assume x is actually coming out of the board. Then we would say this is we call it a right-handed coordinate system. X, y, z is right-handed. Now, if you make a 3-dimensional rotation with a matrix S which is determinant plus 1, the new coordinates axis x prime, y prime, z prime will also be right-handed. So it can be implemented in a continuous way, starting from x, y, z and ending with some x prime, y prime, z prime. If the handedness does not change, you can go from the initial to the final in a smooth and continuous way. On the other hand, suppose you have a matrix S with determinant equal to minus 1. Then what happens is, if you start with a right-handed system, you end up with a left-handed system. And therefore, you say the handedness of the coordinate axis has been altered.
Something like mirror image.
Huh?
Something like
mirror.
the mirror and see the image.
Yeah.
The rotation and minus 1 in real space is
Yeah.
Sir, is it related to the symmetric and antisymmetric property?
No. That will be separate. So, the important thing is that in the case of an improper rotation, you cannot go from x, y, z to x prime, y prime, z prime in a continuous way. It is impossible. Somewhere a discrete change has to take place. A simple example. Supposing I imagine E1, E2, E3 are the original right-handed unit vectors of an orthonormal system. Okay? Along x, along y, along z. Now suppose I say E1 prime is E1, E2 prime is E2, and E3 prime is minus E3. Just change the sign of one of them. Then we would say E1 is this way coming out of the board, E2 is that way, but E3 is down. That will be a left-handed coordinate system. There is no continuous way to go from E1 into E3 to this E1 prime, E2 prime, E3 prime. So that corresponds to minus 1, so that's why we call it an improper rotation.
One small question.
Small, big doesn't matter. Yes.
I have not understood how did you get that limits of SJK is equal to
This one?
Yes.
Yeah, so you start with here, alright, and take, so I will write it again. Now, if you understand the meaning of repeated index, whether I write K or L, it doesn't matter. It is summed over. By the way, you know who invented this rule of summing over repeated indices? Do you know who invented it? No? One of his greatest inventions, Albert Einstein. But money wasn't in the context of special general relativity that he introduced. Can you just imagine, up to his invention, people are always writing summation signs over so many indices. And then this man noticed there is no need to write the summation sign every time. If an index appears 2 times in an expression, you understand you have to sum over it. But then there is another corollary. If in some expression involving vectors and tensors, if the same index appears 3 times or 4 times, you know you have made a mistake. It's such a beautiful, powerful, simple idea. Alright, so this equation is the same as this one. We say J is a free index. It can take values 1 on both sides, 2 on both sides, up to n. L is called a summed index or a dummy index. Whether you write L here or M or N or K, doesn't matter, R, S, as long as it appears in both places. An expression like S, J, J, E, J is meaningless. One should never encounter such an expression. Alright, now I take the scalar product of both sides with right? So what do I get on the left hand side? I get Ej prime. And what do I get on the right hand side? You please dictate to me. I have here this scalar product, right? Inner product. I know that it is linear in this vector, linear in that vector. So, am I able to take out the numbers SJL? What does it mean to say that it is linear in this?
Only it will be like only K elements on the right hand side will be linear. J is
No, first you use the linearity in this first entry to rewrite this in a simpler way. Can I take out the numbers SJL on the left? Do you agree that this is equal to this? Do you agree to that? This is one of the properties of inner product which I gave in the beginning today. On page 8, equation 33, number 2. Yeah? In the product, inner product of x and y, you have linearity in x as well as in y. So if x is a combination of vectors, you can take the combination out. So you agree to this. Now what is this scalar product? Orthonormal basis. So what is this?
delta JK.
Yeah, but with these indices, delta,
K.
delta, LK. So this is S, J, L, delta and K. L is summed over, but this Kronecker delta is non-zero only if the indices have the same value. So what does this become?
Yes.
S, J,
Okay.
K. Alright. So this becomes S, J. So that is this. Okay? Yeah? Alright. So I have brought in the concept of rotations in n real dimensions. The set of all rotations, 3 dimensions, 2 dimensions, any number of dimensions, forms what is called a group. It means a family of transformations with the property that if you do one transformation and then another, the result is another element of the same family. There is something called identity, no transformation, no change. That's called a unitary. And then, for every transformation which you can make, there is an inverse case. If you go from E to E prime, of course you can always come back from E prime to E. So these are the basic ideas of the structure of the group. Alright. So, in this situation, the group that is involved is written in this way, the orthogonal group in n dimensions. Orthogonal group in n dimensions. Sometimes because we are dealing with the real case, people write O, N, comma, capital R, meaning that you are dealing with real matrices and real vector spaces. And now the distinction between proper and improper can also be indicated. Proper rotations in n real dimensions form a group, mathematical, a collection of transformations which are denoted in that way. The S in the beginning tells you that you are performing rotations with determinant +1, not -1. So they are called proper rotations, and that is indicated by letter S. So in 3 dimensions we deal with the group SO3, R. In the plane SO2, R. I may describe some of them later. Okay. So we have been talking about consequences of the existence of scalar product or inner product at the vector level. Now we come to the operator level. So this is on page 9 of the lecture notes. What are the important properties? Given a linear operator capital A, with the help of the inner product, we are able to define what we mean by the transpose of A. That is given in equation 40. So what I would like you to appreciate is the following. Even before we introduced inner products, given an operator A, using a basis in the vector space, we were able to describe the operator A by the means by using a matrix. Now, of course, once you have a matrix, nobody can stop you from constructing its transpose, interchanging rows and columns. But what I would like you to appreciate is that the concept of the transpose of an operator strictly is meaningful only when you have the inner product. And then the definition of the transpose of A is given as in equation 40. Basically it says, it is stated in terms of scalar product for any vector x and y, the transpose of A is a linear operator such that the inner product of A transpose y with x should be equal to Ax inner product. This is the defining equation for the transpose. So now, so I hope this is okay. So equation 41 is a straightforward consequence once you use an orthonormal basis. And now you know this having superscripts and subscripts, you don't have to distinguish between them. Everything can be written as subscript, makes notation simple. The standard joke younger people is that the only exercise that theoretical physicists have is raising and lowering indices. So now even that does not have to be done. So your health will suffer if you have a mirror product. Okay. So equation 41, you can check it for yourself. It is very simple. This definition of the transpose of A becomes the same as matrix transpose if you use an orthonormal basis. Yes?
I didn't understand why you said the definition of inner product is necessary for defining a transpose. So if you look at the level of this linear algebra,
Yeah.
if you have got a matrix into a column vector equal to a vector, if you decide to write it as a vector into a matrix, you will write it as a transpose.
Yeah. So what will happen is the following. If you have only the concepts of linear vector spaces and linear algebra, no inner product, you start with an operator A, you use some basis, in that basis you discover the matrix of A and you take its transpose. You get some other operator. Now take the same A, use some other basis, get its new matrix, take its transpose. The results will not be the same. Transpose of A becomes dependent on the basis. What you get as a result of transpose is not uniquely determined by A. It will be determined by A plus whatever basis you have chosen. Once you have a scalar product, the concept of going from A to its transpose becomes intrinsic. No dependence on any basis. See how it is written. You can write it in terms of scalar product and no mention is made that you have to use this basis or that basis. Okay? So the definition of the transpose makes has intrinsic meaning only if you have a unit. Does it answer your question? Maybe we can discuss it later. Alright. So with this idea of the transpose of a matrix of an operator, I have on the bottom of page 9 equation 42. We have clear-cut statements, definitions for an operator A to be orthogonal means A transpose A equals a unity. Symmetric means A transpose equal to A. Antisymmetric means A transpose equals minus A. Now, usually we always think of these properties in terms of matrices, but all I want you to appreciate is that with the inner product, they have direct meaning. And you do not have to think of, because the matrices, everything can be stated in this inner product language. Okay? So it becomes basis independent. Now you can turn to the next page, page 10. Statement is that in these two cases, in the case of a symmetric or an antisymmetric matrix, if you have a subspace V1 which is invariant under the operator, its complement, orthogonal complement will also be invariant. That's a statement in equation 43. So I won't write it down, you can read it immediately what I have written here. Okay? So if something is unclear, you ask me, I'll try to explain, otherwise I go on. Statement number B on page 10. The statement clear. Proving it, I leave it as a simple exercise. Very easy. Shall I take it? It is alright? Next we go to statement number C. Now we come, when we look at C and D together, we see a difference between the symmetric case and the antisymmetric case. In the symmetric case, it is always possible to find an orthonormal basis in which A is diagonal. You start with some orthonormal basis, compute the matrix of A. If it is symmetric, you can go to another orthonormal basis in which A becomes diagonal. This is always possible. What it means in other words is that real symmetric matrices can be made diagonal by a orthogonal rotation, by a proper orthogonal rotation. This is a very important thing. I will not prove it. It requires some amount of effort. You must be aware of this result and sometime find the proof and convince yourself. So, real symmetric matrices can be made diagonal by using some orthogonal rotation. That's the statement. What about the antisymmetric case? Antisymmetric real matrices cannot be made diagonal using rotations. The best you can do is to bring an antisymmetric matrix into a particular block diagonal form, and that is described in equation 44. So I will just write it here. So this is the antisymmetric case. The maximum simplification you can achieve is the following. You can take an antisymmetric matrix and then you can, by suitable choice of your orthonormal basis, this is the best that you can achieve. It will have small blocks, 2 by 2 blocks, each of which is off diagonal, of course antisymmetric. A cannot be made diagonal. Why? Because the reason is we are dealing in real vector spaces. That's the situation. Now, what will be the last entry in this matrix? It depends very completely on the dimensionality of our vector space. If the vector space was even dimensional, 2-dimensional, 4, 6, 8 and so on, you will have a certain number of 2 by 2 blocks. Suppose the space is 10-dimensional, you will have 5 2 by 2 blocks. But suppose it's odd dimensional, 11 or 9, say 11, what you will find is 5 2 by 2 blocks and then a single 0. So in the odd dimensional case, you can make a convention, the last entry will not be a 2 by 2 block, it will just be a single 0. So I want you to appreciate in a very small way that rotations, real rotations in even dimensions and in odd dimensions do have different kinds of properties. This shows up in many ways in many areas of physics, but this is just a hint for you. So in particular, rotations in 2-dimensional plane have some properties which are quite surprising compared to rotations in 3-dimensional space. That I may come to tomorrow here very soon. Okay. So, in words, symmetric real matrices can be diagonalized by proper rotation. Antisymmetric real matrices can only be block diagonalized into 2 by 2 blocks by real rotations. The key here is that if you insist that you want to reach a diagonal form, you have to use complex matrices. With real matrices, you cannot go any further. Okay, that is it. Alright. Then there is one equation 45 on page 10. It is nice to know. These antisymmetric matrices have a very special role to play from the book theory point of view. If a real matrix is antisymmetric and you take the exponential of the matrix, then the result will be an orthogonal rotation. With symmetric matrices, you don't get any such result. So how do I define e to the power capital A, where A is a matrix? It is the usual exponential series, 1 plus A plus A squared by 2 factorial and so on. Whatever matrix A you choose, that series will always converge. So, exponentials of real antisymmetric matrices are orthogonal matrices. Real symmetric matrices are no such condition. So, some of these statements, if you have not seen them before, will appear a little bit magical, I suppose, but you have to get close to them. Okay, so now it is time to pass on to inner products on a complex vector space. So while I rub the board, you can think of any questions which remain. So I have another what, half an hour? Very simple example which you can do this tutorial maybe is to convince yourself this 2 by 2 matrix can be made diagonal using a real rotation in 2 dimensions. It can be made diagonal. Convince yourself. This matrix which is antisymmetric, convince yourself no rotation in the 2 dimensions can make this diagonal. First one, real symmetric, show that it can be made diagonal. By what? By a real rotation. Second case, show that it cannot be by a real rotation. If you insist on diagonalizing the second matrix, you will find you have to bring in complex numbers. So, because we are talking about real spaces, we have this result. It cannot be diagonalized. Okay. So now let us look at the major properties of inner products on a complex vector space. This is on bottom of page 10. And mainly I will state it in words. Again we write the inner product of 2 vectors in this same equation. We will say we should now be a little careful with the language. In the complex case, this scalar product is not symmetric in x and y. So even in words we should say this expression is the scalar product or the inner product of x with y. It is not the same as of y with x. In place of the symmetry which we had in real vector spaces, now we have something called Hermitian symmetry. In general, since x and y are elements in a complex vector space, we allow this scalar product to be a complex number. Hermitian symmetry says, what happens if you interchange x and y? The result will be a complex conjugate of, so y with x inner product equals conjugate of x with y. So in place of symmetry, we now have Hermitian symmetry. So that is why you see in ordinary words also, we should not say this is the scalar product or inner product of x and y. That would be not the correct language. You should say of x with y. The conjugate of this will be of y with x. Whereas in the real case, we could just say inner product between x and y, of x and y. Now we should say okay. Can we make these distinctions in Hindi and Marathi and Tamil also? I don't know how it is. So ignorant of our own languages. But it is important. Yeah, I am reminded of a very old, very beautiful joke. There was a magazine, a humorous magazine in England called Punch magazine. Older people might have seen it. It's stopped publication, what, 10, 15 years ago. But it had been published for more than a century. And in the early part of the 20th century, when India was still part of the British Empire, they had tradition of very beautiful cartoons. And I have seen bound volumes of the old editions of Punch magazine from 1800. So, sometime in the early 1900s, in one issue there was a cartoon. The title of the cartoon was Babu School Teacher. And it shows a school teacher in a village in India. Of course, he has a dhoti and he has some light coat and a cap. And then he's standing with a board under a tree. The caption says, he has drawn this on the board. And he is telling the class of 8, 10, 12 boys seated on the ground, no girls of course at that time. He says, boys, this is called a right angle. Then he draws. Now, he says, now you may think that this should be called a left angle. But by the orders of the Geographical Society of Government of India, this is also a right angle. Such a simple idea. Not the geographical, what is it that Geological Society of India? Alright, so now come back to scalar product in complex vector space. So we have Hermitian symmetry in place of ordinary symmetry, because this is a complex quantity. Second, we don't have linearity in x as well as in y. We have more complicated properties. In physics, discussions in quantum mechanics, elsewhere also, the usual assumption, the notation is that the scalar product is linear in y. That is, if you imagine putting here C1 y1 plus C2 y2 when the complex coefficient, then this is equal to C1 x with y1 plus C2 x with y2. If that is so, then combining linearity in y with the Hermitian symmetry, what is the behavior with respect to x? It's called antilinear. If you put a combination of vectors here and you want to take out the coefficients, when they come out, they become complex conjugates. So it means C1 x1 plus C2 x2 inner product y is equal to C1 star x1 with y plus C2 star x2 with y. Okay? So it is linear in one vector, antilinear in the other vector, not linear in the other. Now, mathematical convention usually when you change the rules, mathematicians regard inner product as linear in the left factor and antilinear in the right factor. But for physics, this is the convention that was stuck. Alright, last 2-3 points. Non-degeneracy is same statement as before in the complex case also. Positive definiteness and the length of the vector are all the same. Incidentally, this Hermitian symmetry condition means that if y is equal to x, then of course this is real. The inner product of any vector with itself is real, and this positive definiteness says not only is it real, it is non-negative. X is a non-trivial vector, this is greater than 0. It vanishes only if x is a 0 vector. So that is page 10. Now we come to page 11. When are two vectors orthogonal? If the scalar product is 0. Same idea as before. But remember, these are all in complex vector space. Cauchy-Schwarz inequality. I have written it in page 11, equation 48. It looks the same as in the real case. The only thing you have to watch out is that on the left hand side of the inequality, this modulus sign, what is inside is a complex number. Earlier you said is x with y inner product is real, it may be positive or negative. Now it will be complex. So you take a modulus, forget the face. And then you, so proving the Cauchy-Schwarz inequality is a very nice exercise, and I strongly recommend today's tutorial should be tried. Someone must try to do it. Okay. Next you come to the geometrical description of the scalar product of a vector x with vector y. In real dimensions, we introduce the concept of an angle between x and y. That is ordinary trigonometry. Unit vectors, you must allow for the appearance of a phase in the inner product between two vectors x and y. So maybe I will, for general x and y, I can divide by the lengths of x and y, and I think of it in this way. So it means that two vectors in a complex vector space not only have an angle between them, they have a phase between them. And if you remember my, what is it called, public lecture on Monday, I introduced the idea of the Pancharatnam phase. This is the Pancharatnam phase. This is what I had in mind when I said, when he did his work in 1956, if the teaching and understanding of quantum mechanics had been better in our country, somebody might have built up on his ideas and carried it forward. But unfortunately, it did not happen. So this phi is basically Pancharatnam phase. Then statement E, equation 50, is the same statement as in the real case. Given a subspace, there is a unique orthogonal space. So this does not depend on the space being real. So the full space can always be decomposed into any part, any subspace, and is constant. This is always possible. Then I come to F, the definition of orthonormal basis. Straightforward. Inner product Ej with each case should be delta J. G, statement G on page 11 is very important. I just say it in words and I leave the details for you to verify. For the case of real vector spaces with an inner product, we arrived at the group of orthogonal rotations, real rotations in n dimensions, and as a particular subclass set of proper rotations. So what do these transformations describe? They describe the passage from one orthonormal basis to another orthonormal basis. If you are dealing with SON transformations, you are preserving the handedness. Otherwise, you are changing the handedness. Now, suppose these complex and n dimension. How do you describe the transition from one orthonormal basis to another orthonormal basis? The transformations are described by matrices which have the property of being unitary. This is the important thing. So here the condition on the matrix was S transpose S equal to 1. Now, the transformations from one orthonormal basis to another, the matrix is now, for the moment I use the same single S, I will later change it. These are complex n-dimensional matrices. They obey this condition. Passage from one orthonormal basis to another orthonormal basis in complex dimensions is they are described by such matrices, and these are called the matrices of unitary transformations in n complex dimensions. Now this is described in equation 52 on page 11, and I would like you to maybe some of these things could be tried in the tutorials. Now, here there is a small comment which I should add. In the real case, this way, we found that the determinant could be +1 or -1, and so correspondingly we thought of proper and improper rotations. Improper means some deflection operations involved. We talked about the mirror. Okay? Now, in the complex case, what do you get if you take the determinant of this equation? What statement can you make about the determinant of S if S is a unitary matrix? Determinant of S dagger S equals determinant of S dagger into determinant of S. That's a product rule. What is the determinant of S dagger? Dagger means what? Yesterday you did it in the tutorial. Transpose times star. Transpose does not affect determinant. Star will take complex conjugate. So determinant of S dagger equals complex conjugate of determinant of S. So when you take the determinant on both sides, what do you get here? Here you got the result, determinant of S squared equals 1. So you got these two possibilities. What is the statement here?
It will be
Real number.
What is a real number?
Square of that.
Square of what?
If you have x conjugate and x, it is x square.
90.
No, tell me what, I think we can work through it. Tell me first, what is this determinant equal to?
S,
Do the product rule.
yeah, S, determinant of S star,
Determinant of
S star conjugate,
complex conjugate.
yes,
Correct.
into determinant S.
Very good. Now what is this equal to?
1
Determinant of S complex conjugate
I
is complex conjugate of the determinant. Correct?
Yeah.
That is, I think, quite clear. So what is the whole thing equal to?
mod of S.
Correct? Remember, in this case, S is a complex matrix in general. The elements are complex numbers. So, in unitary transformation theory, what this condition, unitarity condition, tells you is only that determinant of S modulus squared equals 1. What does it mean? Determinant of S is a phase. Determinant of S is on the form e to the power I phi for some angle phi. It is not a choice between plus 1 and minus 1. It's not a two-value choice. Determinant of S can be any phase. You appreciate that. This implies that determinant of S equals e to the power I alpha for some angle alpha. It is not either plus 1 or minus 1. It can have any continuous phase as its value. Therefore, while real rotations break up into two kinds, proper and improper, unitary transformations do not break up into two pieces, like proper and improper, or four pieces, no finite number of pieces. The unitary transformation is described by a matrix whose determinant could be any phase, which is something that can vary continuously. Unlike this, strictly two choices only, here there is no such thing. So, this is one important difference between the inner product in real spaces and inner product in complex spaces. I think I have gone through a fair amount. I know I have 8-9 more minutes, but there are several things which I have asked you to verify, and it is better I give you time. Not that you should do it now, but I will stop at this point. And let us hope that in the tutorial, not only will you try some of the problems in those sheets, but some of the derivations of the text also. Lastly, I want to end with one more joke, especially in honor of Professor Mani. I don't know about left angle and right angle. When I was a student in Delhi University in the 1950s, I was an undergraduate student 1955 to 58 at St. Stephen's College. He was my senior by 1 year in the same college. He was a physics honors, PhD honors student. And I had applied for admission for physics BSc honors, but I was not accepted. I was told you can only take mathematics BSc honors. So I was a mathematics student. There were many very talented physicists who were my classmates in physics honors. Many of them are very well known today. In those days, Delhi University had a very good, very high standard of teaching of mathematical physics for physics honors students. Very, very good standard. And they all knew it, they were very proud of it. I was in mathematics honors, and I must say, mathematics honors in Delhi University in those days was not the best in the country. I would imagine physics honors was probably the best in the country at that time. Delhi University Physics Honors was the best in the country. I don't know, maybe Presidency College Calcutta is an exception, Presidency College Madras, but Delhi was, in terms of training and the mathematical aspect, was supposed to be the best. It was the best. So, in fact, two jokes in your honor. First joke, so my physics honors, BSc honors classmates, contemporaries, they were in different class, I was in mathematics. They wanted to show that they knew more mathematics than I had been taught in mathematics honors. So, with a great deal of anticipation and pride, one day they came to me and said, "Do you know what is a Kronecker delta?" I had never heard of it. They had never been taught first in mathematics honors. Sorry, I don't know. They laughed at me, laughed with each other. They don't even know what is a Kronecker delta. This was the first one. This actually happened, and I tell you who the people were privately. The other thing was, as I said, there is the standard of teaching of mathematics in physics honors in Delhi, as I said, is very, very good. So then one student, he finished BSc honors from Delhi University, and he joined for MSc Physics in Punjab University, Chandigarh. Alright, this is a nice story. So now there was a senior person in the faculty in Chandigarh who had to teach mathematical physics to the MSc class. And now there was this student who had joined MSc first year after BSc Honours from Delhi. Now this teacher was a little bit shaky about the difference between determinants and matrices. But he said, I know how to handle this situation. So in the class he says, for boys again at that time, boys, we have to study the difference between matrices and determinants. But I am very happy to tell you that a student who has completed the BSc Honours Physics from Delhi University has joined our MSc class. And I will ask him to tell you what is the difference between determinants and matrices. And boys, they teach very well in Delhi. They do mathematics for physics students very well. Then he tells us, what is the difference between determinants and matrices? And he comes to the board and he says, if you draw straight lines, it's a determinant. If you draw curved lines, it's a matrix. And the teacher, beaming at the class, said, see, I told you. How can they teach in Delhi? Have you heard this one?
By the way, since you mentioned it, when I joined first year, I went to Professor Bhatnagar, who was the head of the mathematics department in SST. He asked me to read group theory. So I'm very in-depth. See, group theory was not part of our, in spite of what you say about group teaching, was not a part of physicists' training. And so there is this theory of finite groups by very Stein, is that I forget?
That is Tensor.
Tensor, you're right. This is why so I went through it and it was certainly to patiently explain a few things. So my department that was
In St. Stephen's.
incensed.
Yeah. See, he was there for my first year in the college, 55.
Then he went to Bangalore.
Yeah, but he never taught me. He
I see.
was teaching at that time the second year, third year students in mathematics honors. When I finished my first year, he left and went away to Bangalore. So I did not get the benefit of being taught by him.
So at that time, group theory was part of, I presume.
No,
No?
he certainly did not have it in our
But
mathematics.
Bhatnagar, in fact, suggested this.
Yeah, he probably knew that the physics students are being taught better mathematics than the mathematics students.
I see.
I had never heard of the concept of
I'm
it.
very grateful to him for having appointed us. And it was a great time reading group theory for the first time.
Did you discuss things with him? once
Yes,
in a while?
yes. And he was patient enough to explain to me.
This is when you are a BSc Honours
BSc
student.
Honours first year.
I didn't study it till 4 years later on my own. So there. Okay.